Welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
We are so excited to welcome Jonathan Payne with us today. He is a British-American writer based in New York City. His first novel, Citizen Orlov, was named a Book of the Month by Apple Books. It won the 2024 IBPA Silver Medal for Mystery Thriller and the 2024 IPPY Bronze Medal for Suspense Thriller. The sequel, Hotel Melikov, will be published in May 2025. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. I've been enjoying your podcast, so it's fun to actually to have a chat with you about it.
You're the one who's been listening. Excellent.
I am the one. I am the one listener. Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
We knew you were out there somewhere. Yeah. Thank you so much. thanks for lending us an hour of your time tonight.
Sure. Yeah. Nice to talk.
Yeah. Welcome to New York, as mentioned in your bio. Your recent transplant and more recent to New York City itself.
That's right. Yeah. So lived in all over the place. Lived in DC area for the last number of years. Nice. London before that. Right. Originally from the north part of England. Yeah. So I'm deeply confused. But we've landed in landed in New York City and just about a month ago, and it's nice to be. And we lived actually outside of New York, up in Westchester County for a little while, a long time ago, about 20 years ago, for a few years, and so it's kind of nice to be. Yeah. Back in New York, yeah.
Bit of globetrotting, which actually tracks with your fictional work as well. There's a little bit of a mirror in there, which is kind of exciting. We're looking forward to jumping into that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, you've moved around a lot in your life, and with this recent move, how does that affect your writing practice and routine? Just being in a new space entirely. What's that like?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've thought about that a little bit, and I've found that it's different in different places. So I don't know why this is, but I never wrote a word of fiction before I moved to the US about 14 or 15 years ago. Yeah. And I'd lived in London for a long time and had written lots of other things. I'd written what you might call creative nonfiction, but just to have friends and family writing blogs, making people laugh and that kind of thing. Yeah. But it wasn't until we had moved to the US, like I say, about 14 or 15 years ago, that I actually started to write fiction. And the story was, my wife will have to forgive me because I have an apocryphal version of the story, but my apocryphal version is that one day, about 10 years ago or so, she said to me, "Why don't you shut up and write a book?" I don't think that's actually what she said. I mean, not literally those words, but I have to credit her with actually, no, seriously, she was the person who said, "You should be writing fiction. Why are you not doing it?" And my immediate reaction, this kind of goes to, I think, a little bit to the imposter theme, right? My immediate reaction was, that's not the kind of thing that I write. I write this other stuff over here. And my wife said, "Why not?" And genuinely, she had seen the kind of, I think she'd seen that I'd got what you might call the chops to do it before I had seen it. And she's an educator, right? She's an artist and a teacher of art. So she spends all her time doing creative process with teenage kids and teaching them what a creative process is and how to find their own creative journey. So she's really knows what she's doing. And she saw that in me before I had seen it. And she said, "You should be writing fiction. Why don't you get on with it?" And so that's kind of how I started doing it. And that's about 10 years ago. Okay. So one of the things that I've learned is, certainly for me, I've always found myself not terribly self-aware. I think, I don't necessarily know. I can't necessarily see my own strengths and weaknesses particularly well. And sometimes it takes somebody else to say, "I can see X in you. What do you think?" And that's what happened in this case. So it's quite something, really.
I mean, I think that's often the case too. It's, we're none of us are our most objective critics, probably. I mean, there's always those blind spots. I want to ask you kind of a corollary to that. This is interesting. Ahead of this conversation, you mentioned to us that you actually experience imposter syndrome primarily when you're not writing. which is a real paradigm shift in terms of like most of the writers we talk to and most of, those kind of people. So how does that kind of work?
I know. I like I said, I've been enjoying the podcast a lot, but every time I listen to almost every episode, I think all these people have got the opposite kind of imposter syndrome that I've got.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
I think, again, this is kind of, we were talking before about therapy, right? So I don't want to get too much into therapy, but look, I think for me, what happened was, I work, as it says in the blurb on the book, right? I was working in the government, British government, doing national security kind of related things for about 20 years. And that's really, we can talk about that, I guess, as we go along, but that's, there's a lot of that in the book, as you will have seen. But I had quite a good government career, got to travel all over the world, do some really interesting things and some dangerous things as well, which is always fun. But I never 100% felt at home doing that. I always felt like an imposter, like I was kind of like, I looked around at the kind of responsibility that I got and the kind of things that I was doing, and I thought, what the hell am I doing here? This is supposed to be somebody else. Surely somebody more serious and capable than me should be doing this job because it's rather important. The idea that they would let me do some of the things that I did was kind of bizarre to me. And so, but I think now, again, looking back, and again, this is kind of like self-therapy. When you kind of look back at it, at the time, I didn't realize this, but I think now what I was doing, it was seeking out the more creative things that were available in that kind of government career, right? Whether that was writing a speech for a politician, or it was writing papers, or I was always looking for the creative things to do. And I think, like I said, it probably took my wife, after the event of having left government service, moved to the States. It was really her that saw the creative stuff in me, and I had realized, looking back, I think that let's put it this way, when I sat down at the typewriter and started to do it, not that it's easy, because you guys know that it's a hell of a lot of hard work, but that I felt almost for the first time, I thought, oh, this is the way that my brain is wired. This is why I felt kind of out of sorts for 20 years trying to do something else, because this is the way my brain was wired all along, and I just hadn't worked it out yet. And it seemed to be kind of odd that in what you might call middle age, it took me till something, whatever that means now, I don't know, but I got to something that you might call middle age before I had realized the way that the shape of my own brain, which is really kind of strange. Like I said, I'm not terribly self-aware, and I think is it better to know that right from when you're a young person? Maybe. Would my writing have been any good when I was a 20-year-old kid? Maybe not. I don't know.
Well, I was going to ask, sort of as a follow-up to that, because it is an unusual thing to have that be what you feel confident in, and the rest of it being sort of the imposter feeling. Did you grow up in an artistic family, or did you grow up in a community that sort of nurtured that side of you as a young kid or something? Was there that dynamic?
Not especially. There were musicians not super artistic, there were musicians in my family, certainly, and writers. I had an aunt who unfortunately died very young, but she was a poet. Okay. My mother was musical. There was little bits of artistic kind of things going on, but it was not super artistic, and that stuff was not over emphasized, I would say. Okay. But I did. I mean, I did plenty of other artistic things, and I guess why did I not start writing early? Another reason, I think, is because I played guitar, and I spent much of my youth in disreputable bands playing loud, bad things in clubs in the south of London. And so that's what I was doing. And I think that was the way that I dealt with all of this sense of imposter syndrome, doing serious government kind of grown-up work. Was the way that I dealt with that was playing guitar in bands and writing songs. And then I only discovered, I think, much more recently, and you guys know this already, so you'll think I'm being a simpleton, but this very, very close relationship between songwriting and poetry and writing fiction. These things are all very close siblings of each other. And so I have it now. My kids are both artistic, and one of my kids is a songwriter. And of course, I'm biased, but he's pretty good. He was much better than I ever was.
Okay.
My other kid is a filmmaker,
Mm.
but based in LA. But I think I'd realized, yeah, when at this period when I kind of had left the government and started writing a few years ago, um, I remembered that, all those years before I had been a songwriter, and that piece of the brain had kind of gone to sleep.
Mm.
And it's such a close relative of the of writing fiction that it was very easy to wake it up again. And I think back to your question, Liz, suddenly I felt like, oh, yeah, I feel at home doing this. I mean, I don't get me wrong, as you guys know very well, you have to be inspired with some good ideas to be a fiction writer, and then you have to then go and do the grind of the work to turn that thing into a book that somebody can read. So it's not easy it's not any easier for me than it is for anybody else, but it just feels, when I'm doing that, I can sit in front of a blank page and feel, this is where I'm supposed to be. And that's kind of nice. It's nice to have found that, even if it took me a little while to get around to finding it.
Yeah. Well, and being that you're a musician as well, I'm wondering if the experience of playing music feels similar to sitting in the chair and getting words on the page, or is it a different kind of connecting to a creative ether or whatnot?
Yeah, it's very different because music is much more performative, right? And writing is only performative when we choose it to be.
Mm.
I must admit, I was enjoying one recently. You were talking to somebody, one of your guests, about the fact that we writers all hate doing the marketing. And of course, I do as well. I hate doing the marketing, but there's one piece of it actually that I do enjoy, and that is when you get to give a reading for your own book, because that kind of thing is more like being a musician. It's like you get on the stage and you get in front of people, and not because I'm super kind of extroverted, because I'm not actually, but because it feels performative, like when I used to get on stage with a guitar and with a band. So that's the kind of overlap that I see. Is most of writing is not performative. I actually prefer it for that reason, because I like the fact that you can sit on your own in a room. Well, you guys are doing it together, but you know what I mean. You're sitting on your own in a room, and you're working on the product, and nobody is going to see that product for maybe a year if you don't want them to see it, and you can polish away at it. And music is, playing music is not like that. And playing music is like chaos in comparison. You jump on stage in some shady club, and you have like 20 minutes if you're lucky, and then you can't hear what you're doing, and then something blows up, and then it's time to get off. And it's, that's how being a musician felt to me. It was kind of chaotic in comparison. So I like the control that I have over the page. I prefer that for that reason, because it's a lot calmer, isn't it, as an experience.
Do you ever find yourself channeling any of that sort of chaotic energy into the writing at certain points or for certain scenes? Does it ever actually come in handy?
I don't think that's an interesting question. In terms of the stuff that I've done, so that's published so far, I'm not sure. Well, I did actually. I had a short story published just recently. Well, I say no. Originally, in a magazine, a German magazine called Fiction Kitchen Berlin, which is a nice magazine that published a short story of mine a couple of years ago. And actually, they're just doing a podcast now. There's an audio version of it going to be on their podcast. And the title of that short story was "On Discovering My Poetry Causes Hysteria." And it's about a guy, and so it was. This is the performative thing, right? So it's me in the first person, except it's not me because I'm not a poet. But it's about a guy who gives poetry readings and then discovers one day, and he writes poetry, this particular new set of poems about saints, about the kind of ancient saints. And he has never had these problems before, and goes to do his first reading on his tour with this new set of poems about saints. And people start to kind of writhe around in moan, in ecstasy in the audience, and the whole place kind of erupts in this hysteria, and the police come to break it all up. And so that you won't find that kind of thing in my novel, but I enjoyed playing around with that idea in a short story setting. And as I say, we just made an audio version of it, so that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
And I think that some of that, so I hadn't thought about it that way, but to answer your question, I think that it's probably the chaos of live music is probably what was in the back of my mind when I was writing that
piece.
Mm.
That sounds amazing. We'll need to get the details on that to put in the show notes for people listening.
I think you'd enjoy it. Yeah.
Well, I just actually want to go back to something you were saying, which I think is a really good segue into Citizen Orlov, which is you were talking about, and I really identified this, talking about feeling like an imposter in your government job and kind of looking around and realizing you have this like breadth of responsibility that it's like, how can you possibly have it? And I definitely had that in my day job over the years.
Right.
And thinking about how much it correlates to your main character, kind of finding himself. I'm going to stop myself. If you could just give like a little bit of the setup of the novel, because it's so brilliant and very much around the imposter syndrome, and then I'll maybe finish the question.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it's the setup. The novel is called Citizen Orlov, and it's set nowhere at all, right? So it's set in a vaguely Central or Eastern European country about 100 years ago. So the setting is between the two wars in Europe. And the basic premise of the novel is Orlov is a fishmonger, right? He's just a working class guy who works in the market, and every morning he walks through the government sector in this unnamed city. Um, and one morning hears a telephone ringing and feels a kind of patriotic need to pick up the phone and be helpful. And this ringing phone is next to an open window. And he feels like, well, this has got nothing to do with me, but this is the government, and this is either the Ministry of Security or its intelligence. He doesn't know which is which because these two security and intelligence ministries are next door to each other. So he decides that he's going to do the noble thing and pick up the phone through the window and answer the call. And he gets a kind of a cryptic message that he doesn't understand, but he's told that it's life and death. And he must deliver this message to this guy called Agent Kosek, and lives depend on him doing it. And so he reluctantly climbs through the window of this ministry that he doesn't know what ministry it is, um, and sets off to find this guy, Agent Kosek. And from that moment on, his life is forever changed because he's then becomes embroiled in a very strange kind of Machiavellian government world that he doesn't begin to understand. And there's a lot of not just espionage going on, but there's also a lot of political kind of machinations going on, different groups, and he doesn't know who he can trust or who to believe, and spends the rest of the novel, I think it's fair to say, trying to extract himself from out of that mess.
It's such a brilliant setup, and from page one, it's so great. And going back to kind of my long-winded, inarticulate beginning of a question, when you were describing your own imposter syndrome and your government job, I'm wondering how much of that experience you imbued into this character, because it felt familiar. And certainly at every turn, he finds these kind of pressures and responsibilities mounting and doesn't even know the full extent of the details of his responsibilities.
Exactly. No, again, let's do therapy on ourselves, shall we, folks? Just for fun. I mean, am I working out 20 years of weird kind of national security work for the British government? Yeah, I think you might say that. It would be difficult for me to pretend otherwise, wouldn't it? But I think there's a more specific kind of link to answer your question, and that is the core premise that I just set up for you, and a little bit more than that, actually, in the first 2 or 3 chapters in Orlov was but actually based on a dream that I had. So if you go back to actually right at the very beginning of COVID. So I had COVID before it was trendy, to have COVID right at the beginning, right at the very beginning, the early part of 2020, and had a really weird kind of bad few days in which I was having terrible dreams, and then one of them was so weird that I got up and wrote it down, and that was the beginning of that. Was essentially the things, and I'm not going to go any further than we've gone for those that have not read it, but that dream really covered the kind of first 2 or 3 chapters of what is now Citizen Orlov. And actually the dream was based on a real thing, and the dream was based on a meeting that actually happened to me when I was still working in the government, when I was summoned to see my boss, who said, "I've got a job for you in Afghanistan. Will you go to Afghanistan?" And that was a real, and I did go to, and that was actually the last thing that I did in government. Was I spent a year in Afghanistan whilst the war was still raging. Of course, I'm looking back now at that in a slightly different way since things have changed, obviously, over there in terms of our involvement. But that meeting was clearly came back to me all the years later in the midst of a COVID fever dream. But in the way that dreams do, it was twisted in such strange ways. And I just had to, so I knew when I woke up the next, after that dream, I knew where it had come from. But I just thought the weird kind of dream twists on it was so compelling that I had to write them down. And I basically started writing Orlov almost the next day, and that's where it came from.
Okay. And Orlov is such a, to the theme of this show where we talk about not only imposter syndrome but imposter characters quite a bit. I find Orlov fascinating in that he is an imposter, but it comes out of, as you mentioned, this sense of patriotic duty, right? So there's a nobility to the ruse, which is an interesting inversion of an imposter character. What was that like for you exploring that kind of motivation for Orlov?
Yeah, it's interesting because I always had tried to be true to him as a person. I didn't want for either myself or you, the reader, to be laughing at the guy. I don't want to look down at him. I wanted him to be a real person. So, okay, he's maybe fairly simplistic in his way of thinking. He's a working class guy who sells fish at the market. He never really did anything else. But that doesn't mean that we should look down at him. I wanted his real kind of the value system that's the moral compass that he has to come out and really shine through the book. And so I think you can have those things without him necessarily being, for example, politically savvy or understanding the things, because there's other characters that can do that. And that was really why we have his partner in the fish business, Citizen Vanev, who is the guy that's at the beginning of the book, at least, is not only his partner in the fish business, but also is the leader of this political group called the People's Front. The purpose of, in a lot of ways, you will probably see in the little device there, is Vanev is a guy who's much more politically savvy and aware of what's going on. So I use him as a device that if I want to tell the reader like what's actually going on out there in the politics of this place, I get Vanev to tell Orlov that, so that as the reader, okay, that's what's happening. But we don't need Orlov so I don't need Orlov to be smart in terms of the ways of politics. But I did want him to be, a sympathetic, real person that the reader could actually attach themselves to and say, you know what, I might do that, and I might have made that decision, and that's not completely unreasonable. Obviously, the circumstances of a lot of the book are kind of absurd. But I don't think if you look at Orlov's individual decisions and his thought patterns, I don't think any one of those is ridiculous or absurd at all. I think they're quite sensible, because he is just using his kind of down-to-earth moral compass and saying, the world is a really strange place. And when you get inside the bowels of government, it gets even stranger. And why can't I trust anybody? And is it not clear whose side anybody is on, and all these things. So what I was hoping was, in writing Orlov, I could write an everyman. Obviously, he's an everyman character that any reader could kind of attach themselves to, not because they're kind of a middle-aged male fish seller, but because I think he's relatable in terms of his moral compass, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel like we have to talk about Russian influence, Russian authors, because there was so much tonally and stylistically that reminded me of amazing storytelling from, Kafka and Tolstoy, and a little, maybe this is off the mark, but, Greg and I are former actors, and we did a lot of Chekhov work in college.
Okay, very good.
So how much influence did any or all of those writers and others have? And was that intentional? Was it kind of an homage? Not at all?
Oh, no. Very, very much an influence, obviously. Look, I'll tell you where it came from. So really, I think when I started writing this thing, I was reading, and I have read for many years in kind of two parallel streams, if you like. I've always enjoyed spy thrillers, and I particularly things like some of the classics, like the 39 Steps. John Buchan is one of the earliest British spy novels, really, in the true sense, and I think still one of my favorites. And Our Man in Havana, and Indeed Anything Else by Graham Greene, and all those kind of things I'd always read. But I was also reading in parallel, quite separately from all that, and really enjoying a whole load of books. Actually, again, it was my wife. It's her fault. She was into all of this even way years back when we first got together. She was into all this weird Russian literature, and not just Russians, but Kafka as well. Of course, was Czech. And so I was really enjoying how over the years reading things like The Trial by Kafka is the obvious one, which more or less is where we get the word Kafkaesque from, because it's about the guy Joseph K. who's on trial and they never actually tell him what the charges are, which is kind of challenging if you're a defendant. And then before him, Dostoevsky, of course, and in particular, I think my favorite Dostoevsky is, funny enough, not necessarily the big obvious ones, but there's a great Dostoevsky early one called The Double. I don't know if you know The Double. Yeah. They've made 2 or 3 different movie versions of it, all of which kind of don't quite get there. But The Double is a terrific book. And then in reading that and talking to an old friend, I realized, he said, "Oh, well, that's kind of inspired by Gogol." And I said, "Who's this guy called Gogol?" I went off to find him. And Gogol, was pre-Dostoevsky and a big influence on Dostoevsky, at least in his early days, and he's written some very strange kind of novellas and short stories, and my favorite one being a story called The Overcoat, which is a real classic about but what do all these things have in common? All of them have got kind of those 3 books that I mentioned, because they've all got Machiavellian, dark, strange government machinery in them, and they've got a single character in the middle of it who's fighting against that machine, or finds himself kind of lost in that machine and doesn't know how to get out of it. And so I obviously those books were a big influence on me writing Orlov, and what I was thinking was putting those 2 streams. Finally, I'm going to get around to answering your question. Here we go. Putting those 2 streams of reading together, I thought, why can't there be like a spy thriller, in which you take, you give. What I imagined was giving my kind of exam question to myself was, let's give the tropes and the rules and the traditions of the spy thriller as we know it over the last 100 years or so to a Kafka or to a Gogol. And what would that turn out like? Because that seemed to me like a crazy mind experiment. And then that's kind of what I was trying to do. So you can judge whether I achieved it, but that was the intention. Yeah.
Well, I think you achieved that, but even more so than that, you also, again, you're writing, you use the word Machiavellian, and this is intelligence. We're talking about espionage stuff, which I think the average person tends to think of with this sort of air of intrigue and cloak and dagger. But one of the more gleefully hilarious aspects of Orlov is how you kind of write the bureaucracy and ineptitude of government undermining a lot of the proceedings. So you've written an espionage comedy, which is, again, not tonally the obvious route. So how did you then kind of bring the comedy into all of those other kind of factors and influences that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the real answer, Greg, is that I can't help it. I often say when we get into these situations on panels and whatnot in conferences,
right,
people ask me, well, how did you some version of this question, how did you land on writing kind of absurd or comic thriller? And the answer is, genuinely, and this sounds cute, but it's not. It's actually true. I was trying for years to write serious thrillers, and it just kept failing for them. They kept not working.
Right.
And I think that again, talking about the wiring of the brain, I think for whatever reason, my brain is wired to absurd humor in a way that maybe that's because I grew up at the height of, in the UK, in the height of Monty Python or something. I don't know what the reason is for that.
Right.
But I think there's an absurd sense of humor that kind of runs through my brain, and I think runs through my family a little bit as well. And so I couldn't escape that. And what I found with the writing group that I used to be part of is that I would bring a serious thriller along and they would yawn and say, "This is really hard work. Why don't you bring us one of the funny ones?" And so I think, just in terms of, you guys know how important it is to have beta reader kind of reactions is really, really crucial. Right. To anybody who's a writer. If you're writing seriously, you need to have beta reader folks who are brutally honest with you, right? Because you're going to save a ton of time with that. And my beta reader folks said, your serious stuff is not working. Bring us the craziest stuff, because that's the stuff that really pops. And that's, I was honestly trying to do the serious thing and may try again one day. But at the moment, I'm in an absurd lane, and I'm probably going to stick there for a while.
Well, is there also, I wonder, is there, having yourself worked in government for as long as you did, is there just an undercurrent of absurdism in the work itself that just sort of also comes?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, of course there is. Yeah. And there's a kind of a dark sense of humor that kind of, when you're dealing with the issues of such seriousness, which you sometimes are, if you're kind of going down a national security kind of focus, which I did for all those years, and went to some dangerous places, including to a literal war zone, and spent a year just walking around there with a bulletproof vest on, thinking, kind of, this is interesting, isn't it? Then there's necessarily, amongst the people that do that kind of work, there's kind of like a dark sense of humor that develops between them, because that's how you survive, right? And so I think inevitably, if I'm looking back at that government career and trying to make sense of it, it just seems natural to me to kind of laugh at it. Not because it was, not laughing at the people that I work with. I mean, there's some terrific people that, I work with, many of whom are still friends now. But the fact that the whole experience was kind of absurd, really, and the level of, as we were saying before, the level of responsibility that you sometimes get. I mean, in Afghanistan, I was literally responsible for the security of the embassy and the lives of 200 people every day. And my job, in a nutshell, was like, don't get anybody killed. Yeah. And I got up every day for a year, and that was my job. Yeah. And so that gives you a certain kind of grounding, I think, in that you don't get perhaps in every job, and it kind of it makes you kind of a little bit humble, and makes you think about fairly existential things every day when you get out of bed, if you see what I mean. And I think some of that is inevitably is going to come out in my writing as well.
I'm just wondering, kind of chicken or egg here, with, I know you mentioned loving the two streams of kind of genre, and spy espionage being on one of the streams, and then these incredibly high stakes you had in Afghanistan, this kind of just high stakes and pacing that happens in your book as well. Like, what do you think came first, working in government? Or were you kind of chasing that in your day job?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think I don't. I'm not sure whether that is directly. I think the style wise, I remember, is you see my book starts very quickly at the beginning, and it doesn't stop really in terms of the pace. And I think that more comes from listening to, I don't even remember who it was, but listening to advice from other, really kind of classic writers over the years. People saying things like, I don't remember who it was, somebody who famously said, if you read back a chapter that you've written and you don't know what it's for, you should cut it out and throw it away and write a different one where something actually happens. And so for me, I kind of set some rules at the beginning when I was writing Orlov. And one of them was going to be, every chapter has to take us somewhere new. We have to be somewhere new, either in physically or in the plot or in the character development. Something has to happen. I don't want the reader to get comfortable. I want you to be on the edge of your seat, and I want to, as soon as you think that you know what's happening, I'm going to kind of swing it off in a different direction and make you feel uncomfortable. And that was my intention. Where does that come from? I don't really so I don't really know, but I think I was just trying to kind of take in all this advice I'd heard from other places, and somebody else who's famously said, what makes good writing? Just cut the boring bits out. So that's what I was trying to do.
You succeeded.
Yes.
Oh well, thank you. I hope so.
Nailed it.
Well, just I'm thinking about, you mentioned a writers group, and we haven't talked a lot about writers groups on this podcast, but I think we should more, because I think they are just invaluable. And I also know that you did an MFA, which is kind of another form of a writers group, talking about like community and support. And with the writers group you mentioned, I loved that they encouraged you to kind of write in the direction of your own voice instead of against it, which I think is a temptation for a lot of writers, especially early on. Did you find that was your experience getting an MFA, or was it kind of a different degree of encouragement or directional that you were getting?
That's a great question. Totally different, actually, from my experience. So, yeah, so mine was actually remote. It was an MA, not an MFA, because it was a British thing that I did out of a London university, and it was 100%. I was looking for one. Partly, I wanted to do a British one because I didn't want to have to deal with being told that I'd spelled things wrong all the time. So I tend to write in British English first of all, and then have to fix it later. Because when Orlov was published, I had a very interesting meeting with my editor, who said, "You know that we only publish in American English, don't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but on this occasion, this book is very special. And you're going to do something different." And she said, "No, we're not. Go and fix it." So anyway, yeah. So I did a completely remote MFA over 2 years in a London university, and the experience was to me, it was very, very different from being in the writers group, which was just much more like a beta kind of. In fact, I would say that the minority of what I did on the MA was what you might call technique and writing technique. It was a lot more of it was academic stuff about learning about the reason that I wanted to do it was much more not to do with technique, but to do with context. What's the history of what I'm trying to do? Who came before me? If I'm trying to write X certain things, what do I need to know about the context? Who's come before? What is the criticism of that stuff that's come before? What do the critics write about it? How does it flow down to what people are doing today? So an awful lot of my MA, they may, I guess they're all different, but certainly my experience was a relative, probably a minority of it was technique, and the majority of it was all around that contextual academic understanding, reading criticism. And I think, to be honest, Orlov would not exist without that course, because I didn't write Orlov. Actually, I started writing it immediately after I had left. I just had graduated. When the dream and the COVID and all that happened, I literally just graduated weeks before all of that happened. So I wasn't writing Orlov in fact, for the MA course, I wrote one of my unsuccessful serious thrillers, which remains unpublished. But I think that I wanted to do it because, and I was going to say to you, I know it's come up on the pod once or twice before, and I do find the kind of controversy, if that's not the right word, about MFAs in the writing community mysterious, because I just don't understand why people worry about it. To me, it's like, if you want to do it, do it, and if you don't, and that's it, right? And you're going to have your own reasons to do it. And my reasons were nothing to do with technique, because you can get technique training from all sorts of different places and groups and courses. You don't need to do a master's to get that.
Right.
I was much more interested in that historical perspective and that contextual stuff and the criticism and all of the stuff that we did that went around it. And in doing that, I think coincidentally, that pushed me into reading some interesting Russian writers, some of whom that we had talked about. It also, another one that was really influential, I don't know if you've come across an Italian guy called Calvino, but one of the things that Italo Calvino is, the guy was a genius, and a crazy genius as well. And one of the things that we read in the Masters was a book called If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller, which is an astonishing kind of mind bend of form. If you want to read for anybody out there, if you want to read a really interesting novel that plays with the form of the novel, I would recommend reading that book by Calvino. And it really made me start to think. Again, this is not a direct line to Orlov necessarily, but it opened my mind to what the novel can be, and how, in terms of form, it's okay. You've got permission to do weird and wonderful things that maybe go beyond just the pure telling of a story that you want to tell. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that all of it is as experimental as what Calvino does. It's absolutely not. It's not intended to be. But If on a Winter's Night is just an amazing experience, and you really need to, I think I would recommend it to anybody it's quite an experience to read that thing. Because the star of that, the main character in the book is the book that you're reading. and it's all terribly meta and strange. And but I think that well, I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is it opened the master's course in particular. Some of these classic writers like Calvino, it kind of expanded my thinking about what the novel can be and what it can do. And I came out of the end of that master's thinking just in a real sense of excitement that I didn't just have to tell a story. I could do other things stylistically around the edge of telling the story. Right. And that it would maybe that it was the kind of alchemy of those different pieces would maybe turn into something interesting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I often think sort of almost to the point that you were making, or I should say to a similar point you were making about this whole thing of MFA versus not, right? That tension of the expectation and the form and the format and everything. I feel like the three of us write what you could call genre fiction. And again, as much as you want to throw labels on stuff, right? But in genre fiction, there is kind of this expectation of a general framework that you're working within. So really with any, when you're going forward now, it sounds like you're able to kind of look at it from the outside in a different way and not necessarily feel handcuffed to that form. I think that's also an interesting way potentially to build tension into something, is when you're bringing a little bit of a different kind of take on what normally would be slotted into, A, B, C, D or whatever. Do you find that bringing that kind of fresh perspective into it gives you like a healthy tension in the writing and the storytelling, the arcs and all that?
Yeah. So like we said before, I mean, although I wanted to do something that was kind of a little bit more unusual, I didn't want to run away. I didn't want to do a full Calvino and just kind of like have a mind experience. I wanted to tell a story. And I had a very particular story with an arc that I wanted to tell. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's a sequel. And in fact, there's a book 3 and the sequel next year. And then there's a book 3 in my head, which is not on the page yet. And there's the whole thing is a trilogy, which kind of has its own. So each book has an arc and the whole thing has an arc, at least in my head. But so I didn't want to, like I said, I wanted to bring the tropes of thriller because I love the particularly the classic British spy thrillers. I've always loved them. And so I wanted to bring all those tropes to the table and do that as well. But to answer your question, again, this is something else that I just stole from somebody who had given this advice, and I don't remember who it was, who said, and this kind of comes out of short story writing, which I did for several years, before I was published with a novel. Somebody had once said to me, the way to make your short story writing more interesting is to restrict yourself, to actually deliberately tie one hand behind your back and give yourself a restriction or two that forces you into a corner to write in a particular way. And and I don't remember, it was probably some genius like George Saunders or something like that. I don't remember who it was who said this, but that I always was thinking about that when I was writing short stories. And then when I got to start Orlov, I thought, well, who's to say you can't do that when you're starting a novel? I mean, surely that's allowed, right? So I thought of 2 restrictions at the beginning that I decided, okay, I'm going to make this more difficult for myself than it needs to be. And one of them was the one that I'd already mentioned at the beginning, we talked about at the beginning, which is that the location of this place is never named. So we don't know what country we're in. We never named the capital. And the other one, which I think is even more influential on the tone of the book, is nobody's going to have a first name in this world, right? Well, they do have a first name, but you never find out what it is. Yeah. And the reason for that is because they all call themselves, in titular way, they call themselves citizen or comrade or whatever it is, all these titles. And this is not really an answer to your question, but I'm going to go there because it reminds me of one thing that I wanted to say about the book. Because we talked about Afghanistan, but that's, of course, not the setting. And the real kind of the influence for the setting was actually a trip that I'd taken within government service many years before that, 10 or so years before that, when I took a trip that was started out in Bratislava, which is the capital of Slovakia, and then Prague in Czech Republic, and then Warsaw in Poland. And I remember I had never been to anywhere like that part of Europe before, and my mind was blown at how culturally different and interesting it was. What they drank, and what they ate and how they spoke to each other, and the kind of a form, what I remember a certain formality in use of titles and all this kind of thing, which didn't felt like kind of old-fashioned in a way that in the UK it had probably gone, that those things had changed a long time ago, and it was still in those countries it was like that. And so when I got to sit down, beginning to write all of them, thinking, all right, this is nowhere. It's like an Eastern European non-country. How do I achieve that? And I thought, well, the way that I achieve that is to make it kind of everywhere. So to bring ideas from all of these different countries that I'd traveled through in the east part of Europe, in terms of sounds, smells, food, the way that people speak to each other and the way that they use titles and whatnot. And I wanted to try and bring all those things to the page. And that's why, I think what happens is that it forced me to write it in kind of a formal style, because everybody has to call them, speaks to each other in formal ways. And somebody actually asked me on an interview the other day, does Orlov have a first name? And I said, of course he has a first name. I just have no idea what it is. Because in his society, nobody uses them, right? So.
Well, you mentioned a sequel and then a third book in your head, and I'm just wondering about the experience of living in this world and then having this world that you've created living in your head over the course of at least 3 books. I mean, that's a lot of otherworldliness existing.
Yeah, it is.
What is that like for you? And are those characters constantly talking to you and leading you down the path?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking seriously about kind of getting out of it and going to do something completely different. And I have, not just one, but actually 2 present day New York City novels in my head. In fact, not just in my head, but one of them I've actually written a little piece of. But the Orlov world kept, honestly keeps talking back to me, and I think it wants to be written, and you'll kind of, what I mean by that. I think all writers will know that it seems to have taken on a little bit of a life of its own, and those characters want to, a lot of readers want to know what's happened next. And there's a couple of, I'm not going to talk about it because I'm not allowed to, but there's a couple of TV people who want to have read it and want to know what's happened next. And I don't know whether anything's going to come from that. So you have to assume that it might not. But yeah, but those characters and the world, it seems to want to keep moving. And so I feel almost like a responsibility now. I've started this craziness to kind of finish the job, and so I do think so. Book 2 will be out next year in 25, and then one of the things I'm going to certainly try to do is to write book 3 fairly soon, because I just feel like there's obviously each book has its own arc, and eventually one day you'll see what I mean when I say that the whole of the trilogy will have an arc as well. And then somebody said to me recently, well, why do you have to stop at 3? Daniel Silver's written 20-something Gabriel Allen books, which he has. That's true, and I've read a bunch of them, and they're great, by the way. But whether or not I want to write, but I think to your point, Liz, can you imagine spending all those years in the same world? It's quite remarkable that anybody can do that. I think he's extraordinary. I don't know whether I would want to be doing this for 20 books, but I think I owe you at least 3.
Okay. Well, we will happily take them and read them and enjoy them and laugh uproariously and be touched and be, kind of enlightened to various themes and global interconnectedness. I also wonder, with we're talking about kind of living in those worlds, right? I think probably you're even more invested when it is, as it is with Citizen Orlov and with the sequels. It's not like you're coming in as an observer and observing an existing place and then sort of like immersing yourself in that. You're really world building, right? You're creating a world. You're taking different scraps, as you said, from other things. But I wonder if that also maybe kind of like feels like there's more of an onus on you or a responsibility to be you've kind of shepherded this whole world into existence. So I wonder if that kind of like ups the stakes for you as a writer, and if that really sticks it in your head, even more so than if you were like writing about New York City or elsewhere.
Yeah, that's that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that before. I mean, my main reason for, I guess, the two reasons. One, why is it set nowhere? One, because I think it just ups the absurdity a little bit.
Right.
But also because I didn't want to, honestly, because I didn't want a letter from somebody, after publication. I wouldn't get angry letters from some guy saying, I went to Prague in 1970 and used. I just can't be bothered with all of that. So I thought, you know what? I know what I need the city to do. I know where I want the cathedral to be, and where I want the Ministry of Intelligence to be, and where I want the river to be, and the bridge and the hotel. And so I'm going to build, rather than go around looking. I mean, Prague is a wonderful place. I was back there just recently, and it's just terrific. It's kind of exactly everything that a European capital should be. But I didn't want to limit myself to that for that reason, because I felt that it would be limiting in terms of me achieving what I wanted to achieve. And so I dreamt up this place with all of its kind of characteristics so that I could kind of put the cathedral precisely where I wanted it, not where somebody else wanted it to be.
It's just writing giving us that outlet of ultimate control. It's just
I guess that's right.
of our little worlds.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to lose the opportunity to also have you talk about a real life con person. You told us a little bit about before the show. So can you share that story? You got a knock at the door.
Yeah, that was really strange. It's a very long time ago. So I was thinking about it actually, you know what? It's your fault, this story, because I had forgotten about this traumatic experience, like literally for years and years and years. And the first imposter hour came on, and you guys started talking about something, I think on the first or second show, about whether or not you'd been conned by an imposter who was trying, somebody who was pretending to be somebody else. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, there was something that happened. So, yeah, the story is years and years ago, we lived in London for a long time next to a train station. And so people would walk past our place to go to get on the train. And one day this woman came and knocked on my door, and I was home alone, so to speak. And she knocked on my door and gave me this terrible sub story about she just was a few pounds short of what she needed to be able to get on the train. And if she didn't get on the train, something would happen and something else was all going to be terrible. And I remember two things at the same time in my brain. One of them was, oh, this is bad, and it's only a few quid, and maybe if I give her a few quid, she'll go away and get on the train. And I'm kind of, sympathetic to that kind of person. And at the same time, I remember thinking, there's something wrong with your face. It's really weird. Your face is weird. Why is your face weird? And these two thoughts were competing in my mind at the same time. And I thought, I don't really understand who this person is, but I'm just going to go and get like 10 quid or something and give it to her, and off she goes. And only after I'd shut the door, I thought, that person was wearing a mask. Who the hell goes to somebody's door asking for money wearing some kind of mask?
Right.
That's just such an odd thing. And then I looked across the street and I saw a guy coming out of somebody else's house and thought, hang on a minute, is there a gang of them doing this?
Right.
I don't know whether there was or not. I kind of looked down the street trying to see but I remember thinking afterwards, like, how could I be so Here's a guy that deals with the national security for a living, and I just was totally duped by somebody wearing a latex mask, which seemed to be really bizarre. I couldn't believe that I'd done that, but there you go.
Well, I'll tell you, that sounds like the kind of plot point one might find in a John Payne novel.
There you go. Yeah. They say that you should write into your fears, right? So maybe I should write about that.
Yeah, jump right in there.
But I blame you two for making remember that story, which I had forgotten many years. For many years.
Sorry, not sorry, because I think you just came up with a really fantastic writing prompt for everyone listening, or for just us.
There you go.
Yeah, there is an aspect of that story, though, that I think is this kind of through line of the cognitive dissonance of the like, something's not right here. I
Mm.
want to be helpful. And also, how could I have fallen for it? Like all of these things
At the
existing
same time.
simultaneously.
And a sense of pressure, like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, you've got to make a decision right now. Like, no, you don't. You don't have to
Yeah.
do anything. You're standing on your own doorstep. You can do anything you want. But I remember a sense of, crikey, I need to make a decision really quickly because there's this person on my doorstep. What am I going to do?
Right.
And it's that I think for people who I think it's fascinating. So, and I've never really written about that kind of stuff, and I know you guys have, or that's the next one is about this kind of thing. But the mind of the con artist and how they dupe the regular person or confuse the regular person into doing something they don't want to do is fascinating to me. And
Yeah.
when you're the victim of it, it's really kind of confusing for a moment there.
Right. And the setting of your own home, the gall of someone knocking on your door in your home, it's the context of it, because that's like half the battle for the con.
Right.
It's like where you are in space and how you feel. And wow, it's
Yeah.
also a great horror movie setup. So
It is. Yeah, that's right.
Sorry we re-traumatized you, but thank you for the inspiration, John. Oh my
No
God, this
problem.
has been so amazing. Thank you so much for spending all of this time with us and your incredible answers. Where can people find you so that they connect with you on social media and anywhere else in the world?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I have, thank you for asking. Yeah, I have a website, which is jonathanpayne.org. And the other socials wise, probably the best place to find me is Instagram. That's John7Payne. So JON7Payne. You'll find me on Instagram.
All right.
Great.
Well, you heard it here first. John, thank you for spending your time with us. It's been great. It's been, uproarious and entertaining and informative. It's everything. We've checked all the boxes that we're going for.
There we go. Thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to you.
You as well.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Herget. Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luoma designed our logo.
And you can find us on Instagram at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Thanks again.